Welcome to Tech Explained. Today we are covering CISSP Domain 2, Asset Security. Now when you first hear that term, you might picture something a bit dry, right? Maybe like, I don't know, counting servers or putting labels on laptops. But, if you really peel back the layers, asset security is, well, it's absolutely foundational. It's the bedrock, really, for protecting everything an organization actually values. And it's not just about the tech stuff. It's about safeguarding the core of the business, its secrets, its operations, sometimes its very existence.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. Asset security is a real cornerstone of information security. And while, sure, it's often weighted around, say, 10% on the CISSP exam, its importance in the real world is just immense. It lays down the fundamental principles, the standards, the processes you need for monitoring and securing, well, anything important. And that definition of important, it goes way beyond just files on a computer. We're talking information, definitely, but also systems, physical places like facilities, equipment, all the software running things, intellectual property, and even those things that are harder to pin down but incredibly valuable, like a company's reputation.
Right. So for this exploration today, our mission, if you will, is to really get our heads around the complete journey of these valuable things inside an organization. We want to figure out, step by step, how do you even identify what's valuable in the first place? How do you categorize it so it makes sense? How do you handle it securely throughout its entire life, from the moment it arrives or is created through its useful period and all the way until it's probably gone forever? It's kind of like tracing the life cycle of value from cradle to grave, essentially. All right, so let's start right at the beginning then. It sounds obvious, maybe, but you really can't protect something well if you don't know what it is and understand, how important it actually is. This domain kicks off by focusing on figuring out how we collect, handle, and protect information across its entire existence.
Precisely. The absolute first step, the foundational one in securing any asset, is identifying it and then understanding its value to the organization. And this isn't just guesswork. It usually starts with a solid, clearly defined security policy. That policy sets the framework, the ground rules for how assets, especially information, are going to be identified, handled, and protected through their whole life cycle.
Okay, so when we use the word asset here, what exactly are we including? Is it just the super sensitive stuff like, say, customer databases?
Oh, it's much, much broader than just that. An asset is basically anything the organization owns that has some kind of value. Yes, sensitive data like customer info is often, front and center, but assets also include the physical hardware that processes the data think servers, workstations, phones, tablets. It's the media used for storage hard drives, backup tapes, cloud storage buckets. It's the people working there. They're assets too. It's the physical infrastructure, the buildings, the data centers, the offices themselves, equipment, of course, the software that makes everything run, and definitely intellectual property, things like patents, copyrights, trade secrets, those unique internal processes. And yeah, even the intangible things like the company's brand image or its reputation, those are definitely valuable assets needing protection.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense now. So if you're trying to protect, let's say, a confidential marketing plan, it's not just about locking down the digital file itself. It's also about the laptop it was written on, the network it might have traveled across, the server where it's stored, maybe even the physical room where the team discussed it.
Exactly right. It's about seeing the whole picture, the interconnectedness of value. And within this wide scope, one of the most critical processes we need to understand is classification. And that applies to both the information itself and the assets that handle it.
Classification. Okay, that sounds like sorting things into different bins based on how sensitive they are. Is that the gist?
That's the core idea, yeah. But it's a more formal, systematic process than just casual sorting. Data classification is the process of grouping data based on a few key things. Its sensitivity, first off. Then the potential impact on the organization if that data were compromised, lost, disclosed improperly, altered, and also any legal or compliance requirements tied to that specific data. This grouping results in assigning a specific classification level.
Okay, so what typically makes data sensitive in this context? Is it mainly personal information we're talking about?
Sensitive data is basically anything that isn't meant for public eyes or isn't explicitly labeled as unclassified. It needs protection either because of its inherent value or because laws and regulations demand it. And while personal info is a huge category, there are several key types of sensitive data that organizations commonly deal with.
Like the stuff that can directly identify a person.
Exactly. Personally identifiable information, or PII. You've probably heard this term a lot. It's any information that can be used, either by itself or combined with other bits of data, to distinguish or trace who an individual is. Think of the obvious things. Name, social security number, birth date, address, maybe biometric records like fingerprints. But it also includes information that's linked or could be linked to a specific person, things like their medical history, financial details, educational records, employment information. And the challenge often is identifying PII when it's spread across different systems and figuring out which combinations become identifiable. Standards like NIST SP 800-122 give detailed guidance on this.
And that healthcare, they have their own very specific category.
Yeah, they do indeed. Protected Health Information, or PHI. This covers any health-related information in any form, paper, electronic, spoken, that can be tied back to a specific individual. Regulations like PII in the United States put really strict rules on how PHI must be handled by healthcare providers, insurance companies, and anyone else touching that data. The complexity there is ensuring PHI is protected wherever it exists or travels, not just inside the main electronic health record system.
Okay, what about a company's secret sauce? Their competitive advantage?
That generally falls under the umbrella of proprietary data. This is any data that helps an organization stay ahead of the competition. Could be trade secrets, confidential business strategies, unique manufacturing processes, unpublished research results.
Protecting this often goes beyond just tech controls. It relies heavily on strong policies, NDAs, contracts, and definitely employee awareness and training because it's often shared internally among people who need it.
So organizations use labels to mark these different categories. Are there standard labels everyone uses? Well, governments tend to use a pretty well-defined hierarchical system. You've probably heard of labels like top secret, which means disclosure would cause exceptionally grave damage to national security, then secret, causing serious damage, confidential, causing some damage. And finally, unclassified, which is basically public information. Now, non-government organizations, businesses, they adapt this idea, but usually use different labels that fit their specific business risks. You might see labels like confidential or proprietary, meaning serious consequences if it gets out. Private, often used for personal data like credit card numbers where disclosure could be disastrous. Sensitive, indicating it needs extra precautions for confidentiality or integrity. And public, meaning disclosure wouldn't cause any harm.
And companies can create their own specific labels too.
Oh, absolutely. The specific names of the labels, how many levels they have, the exact criteria for assigning data to each level, that's all defined by the organization's own policy. It needs to match their unique risk appetite, their business environment, and regulatory landscape. The crucial part is having a defined, consistent system in place.
And the classification level assigned then directly tells you how much protection it needs.
Exactly. It determines the minimum baseline level of security controls that must be applied. And importantly, you need to protect that data no matter what state it's in. Whether it's just sitting there stored on a hard drive, we call that at rest, or if it's actively moving across a network in transit, or even when it's being actively processed by an application in memory in use. Protecting data at rest and in transit often relies heavily on strong encryption to ensure confidentiality. Data in use, though, that presents some unique challenges because it often needs to be decrypted or at least accessible for the application to work with it.
Okay, classifying the data makes sense. But you mentioned classifying the assets too. How does that work for things like hardware or systems or even buildings?
Right. Asset classification is about assigning a required level of protection to the asset itself based on its overall value and how critical it is to the organization's mission. This is driven by understanding the potential business impact if that specific asset were compromised, impacting its confidentiality, maybe its integrity, its availability, or other security aspects like safety.
So how do you decide the classification level for, say, a specific server?
A really critical link here is ownership. Every single asset needs an identified owner. This owner is ultimately accountable for the asset's value and making sure it's properly protected. And usually, the owner is in the best position to judge how important that asset is. Now, a key principle connects data and asset classification. An asset's classification level should generally match the highest classification of any data it processes, stores, or transmits. So if a server handles data that's classified as confidential, then the server itself should be treated and protected as a confidential asset.
Got it. And this classification level also ties into who gets permission to access it.
Absolutely. Classification levels are used directly to determine clearances, meaning who is authorized to access which level of data or which classified assets. And any change to someone's access must go through a formal approval process, typically involving the data owner or the asset owner. And crucially, anyone who is granted access to classified assets needs to be properly trained on the specific handling requirements for that classification level. They need to know the rules.
Yeah, I can see how having this clear system would be really helpful in managing complex situations, like maybe when one company acquires another.
It certainly helps. During things like mergers or acquisitions, classification helps ensure that only personnel who truly have a legitimate need to know are involved in sensitive assessments or transitions. Fundamentally, these classification labels and the procedures that go with them help users understand how to interact with data and assets the right way, limiting how it's shared or used based on its classification.
So it's not just about keeping secrets, confidentiality, but also about the overall impact if something goes wrong, like data integrity or system availability.
Exactly right. A truly robust asset classification scheme needs to consider the impact across multiple security objectives. Confidentiality, yes, the sensitivity, but also integrity, its accuracy and trustworthiness, and availability, its criticality and how quickly it needs to be recovered.
Setting up this entire classification system sounds like it requires some serious foundational work first. Where do you start?
It absolutely starts with policy. You need a clear data classification policy. This policy is the document that defines the different classification levels the organization will use. It clarifies who is accountable and who is responsible for different aspects of the roles, and it documents the overall framework.
So policy first, laying the groundwork. Then you get into the specifics.
Yes, exactly. Based on that overarching policy, you then develop the more detailed standards, procedures, and baselines. Procedures provide the step-by-step instructions for how to actually classify and handle data and assets. Baselines are particularly important. Remember this term. Baselines define the minimum set of security controls required for each classification class. You cannot protect an asset with controls below its defined baseline level. It sets the floor.
And how do the computers and technical systems understand these classifications? They can't read a policy document.
Right. That's where security labels come into play. These are essentially system-readable tags or attributes that get associated directly with the data object or the asset. They enable automated enforcement of security policies by the systems themselves. Think about things like metadata embedded in files, flags set in a database, or even physical tags like barcodes or RFID chips on equipment that IT systems can scan and act upon based on the information they contain. Or GPS tags for tracking location.
Okay, so labels are for the machines. What about for the humans interacting with the data or assets?
That's where security marking comes in. Marking is the human-readable equivalent of a label. Think about placing a confidential stamp physically on a paper document, or applying a visible watermark like draft or proprietary onto a digital file, or maybe using color-coded physical tags on equipment. It serves as a constant visual reminder to users about the sensitivity of the information or asset and the required handling procedures they need to follow. It enables process-based enforcement by people.
And the actual process of sorting everything to these defined categories.
That's categorization. It's the practical step where you apply the defined policy using the labels and markings we just discussed to actually sort the assets and data into their respective predefined classes. It's putting the system into practice.
Okay, let me try to recap this first big section. First, you identify and make an inventory of everything valuable. Assign clear owners to each asset. Then, classify each asset and the data it handles based on potential impact, considering confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Define specific handling rules for each class. Use system-readable labels for automated enforcement and human-readable markings for user awareness. Then, categorize everything according to the established policy, which is supported by standards, procedures, and crucially, minimum security baselines for each class. Wow, that's a really comprehensive first step. All right, so once you've gone through all that effort identifying, classifying your assets and data based on value and sensitivity, the next logical hurdle is, well, how do you actually handle them securely, day to day, throughout their entire time within the organization?
Absolutely. Once you know what you have and how sensitive it is, you need clear rules for handling it. Establishing clear information and asset handling requirements and procedures is really paramount. These procedures are specifically designed to mitigate the risks associated with how assets get moved around, how they're stored, how they're retrieved, and very importantly, who is allowed to do those things. They also ensure that the correct tools and technologies are used for handling. And a key point to reiterate here, The handling requirements are driven primarily by the asset's classification level, not just by the type of physical media it might be on.
So this goes beyond just, say, the secure transport of a lockbox containing paper files.
Oh, yeah. While secure physical transport is definitely part of it, handling is much broader. It covers how we manage data and assets electronically, too. From the very moment they are collected or created, through their active use phase, during storage and archiving, and right up until their final secure destruction.
Okay, what's the main goal we're trying to achieve with these handling procedures?
The big picture goal, the overarching objective, is preventing data breaches and stopping unauthorized data from leaving the organization, what we call data exfiltration. And achieving this involves several interconnected practices and often supporting technologies.
Can you walk me through some of the key practices involved?
Sure. First, there's the concept of data maintenance. This is the ongoing, continuous effort to organize and care for data throughout its entire lifecycle. It involves ensuring data quality, making sure it's accessible when needed, and applying the appropriate security controls consistently.
And you mentioned this earlier, but it seems really important for handling, too, being careful about what you collect in the first place.
Absolutely critical, yes. Data collection limitations. It's perhaps the simplest, most effective way to prevent a future data loss incident. Just don't collect data if you don't have a clear, legitimate business need for it. If you don't possess unnecessary sensitive data, you completely eliminate the risk of it being lost or breached later. This isn't just a nice-to-have best practice. Many modern privacy regulations, like GDPR, actually mandate data minimization as a core principle.
Okay, what about technologies specifically designed to actively stop data from leaking out when it shouldn't?
That's where data loss prevention, or DLP systems, come in. These are technologies designed to detect and ideally block attempts to improperly move or exfiltrate sensitive data. They work based on predefined policies and rules that are often tied directly to your data classification scheme.
How do these DLP systems typically work? Where do they operate?
Well, there are a few primary ways they're deployed. You have network-based DLP, which usually sits at the edge of your network, like near the firewall or internet gateway. It scans all outgoing network traffic, looking for patterns that match sensitive data definitions. Then there's endpoint-based DLP. This runs directly on user workstations and servers. It monitors file activities locally and can intervene to prevent actions like copying sensitive files to a USB drive, or maybe printing a confidential document, or even pasting sensitive data into a web form. And increasingly common is cloud-based DLP. This is specifically designed for cloud environments. It helps enforce your data protection policies as data moves into, out of, or even between different cloud services you might be using. It's worth stressing again, DLP is far, far more effective when you have already done the hard work of accurately classifying your data. The rules rely heavily on being able to identify specific types of sensitive information.
Makes sense. Now, how do those labels and markings we talked about for classification fit into the day-to-day handling process?
They are absolutely crucial guides for proper handling. The labels, remember, the system-readable ones, allow automated systems to enforce handling rules. For example, a system could be configured to automatically ensure that any file with a confidential label is only stored in an encrypted location, or maybe only transmitted over a secure, encrypted network channel. The markings, the human-readable ones, serve as constant reminders to people. Seeing proprietary watermarked on a document prompts the user to follow the correct manual procedures, like maybe using a specific shred bin for disposal, or using an approved secure file transfer tool instead of just emailing it.
The physical or logical location where you keep the data seems like a really important part of handling it correctly, too.
It is, definitely. Data location dictates not only where the primary data is stored, but critically, where any backups or copies reside. For systems you manage on your own premises, the common best practice is often described as the 3-2-1 rule or variations of it. But the core idea is keep a backup copy on site for fast recovery from minor issues, and keep another copy, ideally geographically separate, off-site. This is to survive a major disaster that might impact your primary location, think fire, flood, etc. And the distance between the primary site and the off-site backup location matters. Too close, and the same regional event could potentially damage both.
What about the type of storage media used? Does that affect handling?
Yes, storage requirements are directly driven by the data's classification. Highly sensitive data naturally require storage solutions that provide a commensurate level of protection. This could mean things like strong encryption applied to the storage media itself, tightly restricted physical access to the storage devices, and detailed auditable logs of who accessed the data and when. So you need to define different storage locations, procedures, and technical controls based on both the type of storage media being used, SSD versus tape versus cloud object storage, and fundamentally the classification level of the data being stored there.
Okay, which brings us inevitably to the end of the line for data, when it's no longer needed. Destruction.
Yes, data destruction. This phase is governed by your data retention and archiving policies. Organizations have a responsibility, often a legal or regulatory one, to securely destroy data once it's no longer needed for any legitimate business, legal, or compliance reason. Holding onto data indefinitely creates unnecessary risk. The policy must clearly dictate which destruction methods are considered acceptable for each specific data type and classification level. Often these policies will reference established standards like NIST SP 888, which provides detailed guidance on media sanitization.
Destroying data sounds straightforward, but I have a feeling just dragging a file to the trash bin isn't going to cut it, especially for sensitive information.
You are absolutely right that simple delete action is rarely sufficient. When you delete a file in most operating systems, you're typically just removing the file system's pointer or index entry that points to where the data blocks are located on the storage media. The space occupied by the data is marked as available for reuse, but the actual data bits often remain physically on the media until they happen to be overwritten by new data. This leftover residual data is what we call data remnants.
So how do you actually make sure that data remnants is truly gone, especially for sensitive?
For data classified as sensitive, private, or classified, you absolutely need to employ specific, much stronger techniques to ensure complete removal. There's a generally accepted hierarchy of effectiveness for these data destruction or sanitization techniques, usually defined as erasing, then clearing, then purging, and finally, destruction. Erasing, as we said, is the weakest. It's often just that simple delete operation, leaving significant remnants behind, easily recoverable in many cases. Clearing is a step up. It involves techniques designed to remove sensitive data so that it cannot be retrieved using normal system recovery functions or standard software recovery tools. Clearing often involves overwriting the data on the media, perhaps with a single pass of zeros or a random pattern. But research has shown that with advanced forensic tools, fragments of the original data might still be recoverable sometimes. Formatting a drive usually falls into this category, or even below it, a standard format often leaves most data intact and easily recoverable. Purging is a more rigorous level of sanitization. The goal here is to render the target data unrecoverable using any known technique. It aims for complete removal. Purging often involves multiple overwriting passes using specific bit patterns, sometimes combined with other techniques. Another common purging method is degaussing. Degaussing uses a very powerful magnetic field to completely destroy the magnetic domains on media like traditional magnetic hard drives and tapes, effectively scrambling the data beyond recovery. However, degaussing has absolutely no effect on optical media like CDS DVDs or on solid-state drives, SSDs. It's also important to note that even purging might not be considered acceptable for the absolute highest levels of classified data, like top-secret information. The highest, most secure level is destruction. This means physically destroying the storage media itself, rendering it completely unusable and the data inherently unrecoverable. Common methods include shredding to very small particle sizes, burning or incineration, pulverizing, chemical disintegration, or crushing. For modern electronic components like SSDs, which use complex wear leveling algorithms that can spread data fragments unpredictably, physical destruction is often considered the only truly reliable method to guarantee data cannot be recovered. Even manufacturer-provided secure erase functions on SSDs might not always clear all internal memory areas. Now, there's another method gaining a lot of traction, especially relevant for cloud environments where you don't have physical control over the hardware. It's called cryptographic erasure, sometimes known as crypto shredding. The idea is simple. You encrypt the data using strong encryption with a unique key before you store it. When you want to destroy the data, you simply permanently destroy every single copy of that encryption key. Without the key, the encrypted data is just computationally infeasible to decrypt. It's effectively useless random noise. Where this fits in the hierarchy is interesting. It sits somewhere between purging and clearing. If the key destruction is truly permanent and irreversible, and the encryption algorithm remains strong, it effectively achieves purging. If there's any chance the key could be recovered or the encryption broken, it's closer to clearing. But in many cloud scenarios, it might be the only practical secure method available.
So it's absolutely critical to pick the right destruction method based on how sensitive the data is. You can't just use the same method for everything.
Absolutely. The organization's data handling policy must explicitly define which sanitization or destruction methods are acceptable for each specific data classification level. This ensures consistency and appropriateness. The goal, ultimately, is what's called defensible destruction.
Defensible destruction. What does that mean exactly?
It means eliminating data using a process that is controlled, legally sound, compliant with relevant regulations, and, crucially, auditable. You need to securely destroy the data in a way that renders it provably unrecoverable using methods that are considered reasonable and consistent for that type of data and its classification. And you need to be able to demonstrate or prove, perhaps through logs or certificates of destruction, that the data is indeed unrecoverable should you ever be questioned about it in a legal or regulatory context.
That's fascinating. Even deleting data is way more complex than it seems. Now, flipping that around, are there techniques used maybe in forensics to actually find data that someone thought was properly deleted or destroyed?
Yes, absolutely. In the field of computer forensics, investigators use various techniques, one common one being file carving. File carving is a technique used to recover files directly from the raw data on a storage device, often bypassing the file system's directory structure or index entirely. It works by searching for known file headers and footers, specific data patterns that mark the beginning and end of different file types, and then extracting the data between them. It's often effective for recovering files that have been deleted, where the pointer is gone but the data remains, or even from drives that have been formatted, or where the file system itself is corrupted. The existence and effectiveness of techniques like file carving underscore precisely why using robust, appropriate destruction methods is so vitally important for truly sensitive data. You can't assume deleted means gone.
Okay, right. So we've covered identifying and classifying assets, and we've dug into how to handle them securely throughout their life cycle, including that crucial destruction phase. Now, how do we ensure that when people and systems actually need to use or access these assets, they're doing it securely? This seems like where the operational side really kicks in.
Exactly. This moves us into the realm of securely provisioning information and assets, which is very closely tied to ongoing security operations practices. The main purpose here is to safeguard all these assets we've identified, the information, the systems, devices, facilities, applications, while they are actively being accessed or used for business purposes. This involves proactively identifying potential threats and vulnerabilities related to access and usage, and then implementing the right controls to reduce the associated risks. Performing regular security audits and reviews of access controls and provisioning processes is also essential here. It demonstrates due care and helps ensure the controls remain effective.
What are the really core fundamental principles that should govern who gets access to what?
Two principles stand out as absolutely fundamental pillars of secure access control: need to know and least privilege. Let's break those down. Need to know is pretty intuitive. It means granting users access only to the specific data or resources that they absolutely need to perform their currently assigned work tasks. Access isn't granted broadly. It's based specifically on their role, their job function, or explicit authorization for a particular task or project. If they don't need it to do their job right now, they shouldn't have access. Least privilege is very closely related, but it focuses more on the permissions or actions someone can take once they have access. It means granting a subject, and remember, a subject isn't just a human user. It can be a program, a process, a service, even another computer interacting with a resource, only the absolute minimum set of privileges or rights necessary to perform its assigned task, and absolutely no more. For example, if a user only needs to read information in a file, they should only be granted read permission, not write, delete, or execute permissions. Give them the bare minimum they need, nothing extra.
Okay, so who gets to decide who actually needs access and what level of privilege they should have? Who makes those calls?
That loops right back to the ownership and roles we discussed earlier, particularly for data. The data owner holds the ultimate organizational responsibility and accountability for the data they own. They are typically a senior manager who understands the business value and sensitivity of the data. They are accountable for ensuring that appropriate security controls, including access controls, are in place. Now, they often delegate the day-to-day implementation and management tasks, but that ultimate accountability stays with the data owner. They make the final policy decisions about who can access their data.
And what about the person responsible for the actual computer system or server where the data is stored?
That role is the system owner. They have responsibility for the specific computer system, the hardware, the operating system, supporting software, configurations where the data resides or gets processed. This applies even if the system is a cloud-based implementation. There's still a system owner role, perhaps managing the cloud configuration and services. The system owner's responsibilities typically include overseeing the system's operation, ensuring proper maintenance and patching, managing procurement, developing and maintaining the system's specific security plan, ensuring users and support staff get appropriate security training related to that system, and assisting with the implementation and assessment of security controls on their system. This role is well defined in standards like NIST SP 818.
Got it. Now, with all these different assets floating around, hardware, software, data, intangible stuff, how do organizations possibly keep track of everything so they know what needs protecting and how to provision access correctly?
They absolutely must maintain an accurate and comprehensive asset inventory. This is essentially a complete list, a catalog of all the assets the organization owns or is responsible for across the entire enterprise. Creating and maintaining this inventory is the fundamental first step for both the classification process we talked about earlier and for ongoing asset management and secure provisioning. You simply cannot protect assets if you don't know they exist, what they are, or where they are.
And just to reinforce, this inventory includes more than just the obvious IT stuff like computers and servers.
Oh, absolutely. It needs to cover the tangible assets. Yes, that's the physical IT hardware, network devices, peripherals. But it also must include critical intangible assets, things like patents, copyrights, trademarks, valuable intellectual property, trade secrets, even the company's reputation. These intangible assets often represent significant current or future revenue streams and hold immense value, so tracking and protecting them is essential. For example, knowing you have a patent and tracking its expiration date, which is typically 20 years in the US, is crucial for maintaining that protected intellectual property.
So asset management is the broader ongoing process that uses this inventory to manage all these different types of assets.
Exactly right. Asset management is the continuous lifecycle process of managing both the tangible and the intangible assets. It starts with creating and maintaining those accurate inventories. It involves tracking the assets throughout their life, and it includes implementing the necessary steps and controls to protect them from acquisition or creation until disposal or expiration. The primary goal of asset management from a security perspective is to prevent losses of any kind related to these assets, whether through theft, damage, unauthorized access, misuse, or loss of value.
How do organizations typically manage the tangible assets, like all the hardware, efficiently?
For IT hardware, organizations often rely on automated tools like configuration management systems or CMS, sometimes part of a larger configuration management database, CMDB. These systems help discover, track, and manage IT resources and their configurations. Physical tracking can be aided by using methods like barcodes or RFID tags on equipment integrated with the inventory system. For software assets operating systems, applications management involves not only tracking installations, but also carefully monitoring license compliance. This is crucial to avoid legal penalties and also to ensure that unauthorized or potentially harmful software isn't installed on systems. And managing intangible assets like intellectual property involves a combination of legal mechanisms like patents and copyrights, strong internal policies, access controls on related data, and continuous monitoring to protect them from infringement or theft.
This whole process of managing assets and provisioning access seems heavily reliant on accountability, doesn't it?
It absolutely is. Accountability in this context means ensuring that robust account management practices are in place. This ensures that only authorized users are able to access systems and data, and, just as importantly, that when they do access them, they use the systems and data properly, strictly adhering to their assigned privileges and their established need to know. Every significant action taken should ideally be traceable back to a specific authorized user or process. That's the essence of accountability and secure provisioning.
We've mentioned the data lifecycle quite a few times now. It seems central to this whole domain. Let's maybe break down the different stages and clarify the specific responsibilities involved a bit more.
Yes, understanding the data lifecycle in detail is absolutely key to protecting data effectively. It refers to the entire journey of data from the point it's first created or collected all the way through its active use, storage, archiving, and eventually its secure destruction. Protecting data throughout this lifecycle involves managing it as it transitions through various states and requires the coordinated efforts of several distinct roles within the organization.
We've touched on some of these roles already, but maybe we can lay them all out clearly now to see how they fit together across the lifecycle.
Certainly. Thinking about the key players involved in managing data through its lifecycle, we have first, the data owner. Remember, this is the high-level authority figure, usually a manager, who has the ultimate organizational responsibility for a specific data set. They're accountable for its protection, deciding its classification, and defining access rules. Then, the system owner. They're responsible for the technical system, the infrastructure that stores or processes the data. Think hardware, OS-related software configurations. Next is the data controller. This role is particularly important in the context of privacy regulations like GDPR. The controller is the person or entity that determines what personal data gets processed, why it should be processed, and how it's processed. For instance, a company deciding to collect employee HR data for payroll processing is acting as a data controller. Now, if that company sends the payroll data to a third-party service provider to actually run the payroll, that third party becomes the data processor. A data processor acts only on behalf of the data controller and processes data, often PII, strictly according to the controller's documented instructions. They have a direct responsibility to protect the data's privacy and use it only as directed. GDPR places significant obligations on processors and often restricts data transfers outside the EU, leading many organizations to formalize these roles and relationships contractually. Then we have the data custodian. This role often involves delegated day-to-day responsibilities frequently assigned by the system owner. The custodian has the technical responsibility for storing and safeguarding the data. This includes tasks like performing regular backups, system maintenance, implementing security controls, archiving data, preventing loss or corruption, and performing data recovery when needed. Distinct from the custodian is the data steward. The steward has more of a business responsibility for the data. They focus on aspects like data governance, ensuring data quality and accuracy, maintaining compliance with business rules, defining metadata, data about the data, and ensuring the data is fit for its intended business purposes. They care about the data's meaning and usability. We also have security administrators. Their role is broader, ensuring the overall security of the IT infrastructure. This involves finding vulnerabilities, monitoring network traffic, configuring security tools like firewalls and antivirus, helping devise security policies, and sometimes training staff on security practices. Supervisors, of course, oversee all these different entities and the support personnel, ensuring operations run smoothly and staff are properly skilled and performing their duties correctly. And finally, we have the users. This is any person who accesses data or systems to perform their work tasks. They are considered subjects interacting with objects, the data or resources. Their access must be granted based on their role and need to know, and they have a responsibility to comply with all security policies and procedures.
Wow, that's quite a team of distinct roles involved just in handling data properly through its life. And that whole process starts with collection, right?
It does, and again, it bears repeating. The easiest way to prevent data loss down the line is simply not collecting data you don't absolutely need in the first place. Always limit collection to data that serves a clear, documented purpose.
Okay, once it's collected, where it's kept is important.
Right. Data location refers to where the primary data and any backups are physically or logically stored. As we discussed, best practice for on-prem systems generally involves keeping copies both on-site for quick recovery and off-site, sufficiently far away to protect against site-wide disasters.
Then comes the ongoing phase of data maintenance.
Data maintenance is essentially managing the data throughout its active lifecycle, from creation through its usage and updates until its eventual retirement. It's an ongoing process, often supported by automated tools, focused on ensuring data is available when needed, but also unavailable or archived when it's not. It involves preserving sensitive data for as long as business or regulations require, but no longer. During this phase, sensitive data should ideally be encrypted where possible, and the basic security controls related to confidentiality, integrity, and availability, CIA, should be applied consistently according to policy based on the data's classification.
Which naturally leads into the concept of data retention. How long do you keep it?
Exactly. Data retention requirements don't just apply to the data itself, but often extend to the media holding it, the systems that processed it, and even the personnel who accessed it through logs. Record retention is fundamentally about keeping information for as long as it's genuinely needed, and then destroying it securely when that need expires. There's actually a noticeable trend, particularly with things like email, towards implementing shorter retention policies, specifically to reduce legal liabilities associated with holding old communications.
What are the key questions an organization needs to answer regarding retention?
There are three main ones. First, how to retain the data, ensuring it remains accessible and readable if needed, while still considering its classification and perhaps using a formal taxonomy or archiving structure. Second, how long to retain the data, the specific duration. While a general business guideline of 7 years is sometimes mentioned, this varies enormously depending on the country, region, specific industry regulations like healthcare or finance, and the type of data. Third, What data actually needs to be retained? This must be clearly defined based on organizational requirements, balancing business value against legal obligations and risk.
And after that retention period's up, if the data is truly no longer needed, back to destruction.
Right. And remembering data remnants, that residual data left behind after simple erasure methods like leftover magnetic flux on a drive platter or data lingering in slack space. Slack space can even sometimes get filled with fragments of data from the computer's memory, RAM, which is a key reason why processing highly classified data on unclassified systems is strictly forbidden. Memory contents could leak into slack space on the hard drive. So eliminating remnants effectively is absolutely critical when dealing with sensitive data. Data destruction, then, is the formal process of eliminating that sensitive data when it's no longer required. The organization's policy must define the acceptable methods based on classification level. And we discussed the hierarchy. Destruction, physical methods like shredding or crypto shredding, is the highest assurance, followed by purging, like degaussing for magnetic media or multiple overwrites, then clearing, like a single overwrite, then basic erasing, like a simple delete, and finally just formatting, which is often the least effective. Remember, degaussing only works for magnetic media, and physical destruction is generally the best or only reliable method for SSDs. The ultimate goal is that defensible destruction, provably unrecoverable data, eliminated in a compliant and documented way.
Okay, thinking about keeping data for potentially very long periods as required by some regulations, you also need to think beyond just the data itself. You have to consider the assets that hold or process that data, right?
That's an excellent point, and absolutely critical for long-term retention strategies. Asset retention isn't just about archiving the data bits, it's equally about ensuring you retain the capability to access and read that data in the future. This includes the hardware needed to read the storage media, think old tape drives or specific server models, the software required to interpret the data, like legacy operating systems or specific application versions, and even the personnel who possess the knowledge to operate that potentially obsolete hardware or software to perform a restoration if needed. Even if you perfectly maintain the data archive for the required retention period, it's effectively useless if years later you discover you no longer have the functional hardware or compatible software required to actually read it.
This sounds like where terms like end of life and end of support become really important planning factors.
Exactly. These vendor-defined milestones are crucial. End of life, EOL, typically means the vendor has stopped selling a particular product. More critical from a support and security perspective is end of support, EOS, or sometimes called end of service life, EOSL. This is the date after which the vendor will no longer provide technical support, bug fixes, or, very importantly, security patches for the product. These EOL and EOCOSL dates apply to both hardware and software components. So when you're planning for long-term data retention, you absolutely must factor in the projected EOL and EOS dates of all the assets, hardware, operating systems, applications, databases that are required to access and interpret that archived data. This might force you to periodically migrate archived data to newer formats or platforms before the old ones become completely unsupported. Or in some cases, you might need to maintain specific obsolete systems in a secure, isolated environment just for the purpose of accessing old archives, which introduces its own set of complexities, risks, and costs.
Okay, so bringing this all together, we know what assets we have, we've classified them, we understand their life cycle and the roles involved, we know how to handle them, including retention and destruction, and we've considered the lifespan of supporting tech. How do organizations then select the specific security controls needed to protect data effectively in its various states, while also making sure they're meeting all the external rules and regulations?
Right. This final piece is about determining the appropriate data security controls and ensuring you meet all relevant compliance requirements. You need a strategy that selects and implements controls designed to protect data effectively in each of its primary states: data at rest, data in transit, and data in use. Each state presents different risks and requires somewhat different technical approaches. And it's generally acknowledged that providing robust, foolproof protection for data while it's actively in use, i.e. being processed in memory or CPU, is often the most challenging compared to protecting data sitting at rest or moving across a network.
We touched on the states briefly before, but let's quickly revisit them and the types of controls typically applied.
Sure. The three fundamental data states are data at rest. This is any data that's stored persistently on some form of media, internal hard drives, external drives, USB sticks, backup tapes, SAN or NAS storage, cloud storage, even optical media. Encryption is the absolute key control here for ensuring confidentiality. Think full disk encryption, database encryption, file level encryption, data in transit, or data in motion. This is data being transmitted over a network, whether it's internally on your LAN, across the internet, or to from cloud services. It's data moving from anywhere to anywhere. Again, encryption is essential. Think TLSSL, securing web traffic, HTTPS, IPsec, creating secure VPN tunnels, SSH for secure remote administration. The principle should be to use encryption whenever possible, even for internal application traffic. DLP solutions are also very relevant here, scanning network traffic to detect and potentially block sensitive data based on content rules, like preventing social security numbers from being emailed externally. Data in use. This is data that's currently loaded into temporary storage like system RAM or CPU registers and is being actively processed by an application. Protecting it here is tricky because it often needs to be in a decrypted or accessible state for the application to work. Controls often focus more on securing the environment where the processing happens, ensuring systems are fully patched, using standardized secure system builds, running robust antivirus, anti-malware software. Secure application design is also critical. Applications should be coded to minimize the time-sensitive data spends in memory and to securely flush memory buffers when the data is no longer needed. Some modern solutions like CASBs, Cloud Access Security Brokers, can help here too, particularly for cloud applications by combining features like DLP, web application firewalls, authentication controls, and network security to protect data being used within and transiting to from cloud resources.
What are some other specific data protection methods or technologies organizations might employ beyond just general encryption?
Well, we've mentioned encryption heavily as it's primary for confidentiality at rest and in transit. You need to consider all storage locations, tapes, USBs, RAID arrays, SAN, NAS, optical media. Another technology is digital rights management, or DRM. This is typically used to protect copyrighted materials like videos, music, or ebooks, but the concepts can apply more broadly. DRM attempts to prevent unauthorized use, modification, or distribution of digital content. DRM often involves encrypting the content, but also embedding rules about how it can be used, like limiting the number of times it can be played, restricting the devices it can be used on, or preventing printing. A key feature often touted for DRM is that the protection travels with the data, meaning the rules are enforced wherever the data goes. This can make it useful for certain types of data at rest, especially when system-level volume encryption isn't feasible or appropriate. We also mentioned Cloud Access Security Brokers, CASBs. These are software solutions, either on-premises appliances or cloud-based services that sit logically between your users and the cloud-based resources they access, like SaaS applications or cloud storage. Their purpose is to ensure that your security policies and compliance requirements are enforced consistently for cloud usage, just as they would be for internal resources. They provide visibility into cloud app usage, enforce data security policies, often including DLP capabilities, detect threats related to cloud accounts or data, and help meet compliance mandates. As mentioned, they're particularly helpful for protecting data in use and in transit within cloud environments, often built on 4 pillars: visibility, data security, threat detection, and compliance. And particularly relevant for privacy, especially when dealing with PII or PHI, organizations employ methods like anonymization and pseudonymization. Anonymization aims to remove individual identities permanently from a dataset, replacing private data with values that are still useful for analysis but cannot be linked back to specific individuals. If done correctly, for e.g., using techniques like randomized masking, the process is irreversible. The original person cannot be re-identified from the anonymized data. Pseudonymization is slightly different. It replaces identifying data elements with pseudonyms or aliases, essentially placeholders. This prevents the data from directly identifying an entity. However, unlike true anonymization, pseudonymized data can potentially be reversed or re-identified if the separate dataset or key that links the pseudonyms back to the original data is available. Because they can potentially be reversed, pseudonymization, along with techniques like tokenization and even some forms of encryption, are sometimes grouped under the term quasi-anonymization. Tokenization is a specific form of pseudonymization, very common in payment card processing. It replaces sensitive data, like a full credit card number, with a unique, randomly generated token. This token has no intrinsic meaning or value outside the secure token vault system that created it and holds the mapping back to the original card number. Think about when you register your credit card with a mobile payment app. Your card info goes to a secure tokenization vault, which creates a unique token linked to your phone account. When you make a purchase, the merchant's point-of-sale POS system only sees and handles the token. The payment processor uses the token to look up the actual card info in the vault, processes the charge, and sends back an approval or denial. The key benefit is that the merchant's POS system never stores or even handles the real credit card number, significantly reducing the risk if the merchant system is compromised.
And going back to data moving across networks, data in transit, you mentioned standard encryption like TLS, SSL. Are there other concepts related to how the data travels?
Yes, beyond the basic link encryption, there are concepts like end-to-end encryption and onion networks that provide different levels of protection for data in motion. End-to-end encryption means the actual data payload of a packet is encrypted right at the source, the sender's machine, and remains encrypted as it traverses all the intermediate network nodes, switches, routers, firewalls, until it reaches the intended final recipient, where it's finally decrypted. The data is never in plaintext while it's traveling on the network links. A virtual private network, VPN tunnel, is a perfect example of end-to-end encryption between 2 points. The main limitation, however, is that the network routing information, like the source and destination IP addresses in the packet headers, must remain in plaintext and visible so routers know where to send the packet. So end-to-end encryption provides confidentiality for the data, but doesn't inherently provide anonymity for the communication endpoints. Onion networks, on the other hand, are specifically designed to provide both confidentiality of the data and anonymity for the sender and receiver. The sender predetermines a path through a series of volunteer nodes in the network. They then encrypt the entire packet multiple times using layers of encryption, like peeling an onion. Each layer uses the public key of a specific node along the path. The first node decrypts only the outermost layer, revealing the address of the next node in the path. That next node decrypts its layer, revealing the node after that, and so on. The actual data payload inside remains encrypted until it reaches the final destination node, which holds the key to decrypt the innermost layer. Crucially, each node in the path only knows the IP address of the node immediately before it and the node immediately after it. This makes it extremely difficult for any single node or even an observer monitoring network traffic to determine both the original source and the final destination of the communication. The most well-known example is Tor, the onion router. The main trade-off with onion routing is typically performance, as the data has to hop through multiple nodes and undergo multiple layers of encryption-decryption.
Okay, it sounds like there's a vast array of protection methods and layers available. How do organizations navigate all this complexity and actually choose the right set of controls for their specific needs?
It's a structured process. They typically start by establishing baselines. A baseline is a documented minimum level of security configuration or a minimum set of controls that is allowed by a particular standard or by the organization's own policy for a given system type or data classification level. Then they refine this generic baseline using processes called scooping and tailoring to make it fit their specific context. Tailoring is the process of modifying the list of security controls within a standard baseline to align it more closely with the organization's specific mission, operational environment, and risk tolerance. This involves several steps, like identifying common controls that apply across multiple systems, specifying values for organization-defined parameters within controls, applying specific scoping guidance, selecting compensating controls if a primary control isn't feasible, and assigning specific values or strengths where controls allow options. Scoping is really a part of the tailoring process. It focuses on setting the boundaries for where the controls apply. It involves limiting the recommendations from a general baseline by explicitly removing controls that are simply not applicable or relevant to the specific systems or assets you're trying to protect. You review the full baseline list and select only those controls that make sense for your particular situation.
And they also absolutely need to consider rules coming from outside the organization.
Oh, absolutely. Compliance is a huge driver. Organizations must identify all applicable external standards, laws, and regulations that apply to their industry, and the type of data they handle. Common examples include PCI DSS for credit card data, AIPA for health information, GDPR or CCPA for personal data privacy, SOX for financial reporting, and many others. They need to ensure the controls they select and implement fully meet the requirements of these mandatory standards. Even when specific regulations aren't legally mandated, leveraging well-designed community standards like the extensive NIST Special Publication 800 series can provide extremely valuable guidance for selecting effective controls. There's often a formal standard selection process organizations use to plan, choose, and document the specific technologies or architectures they will implement, aiming for objectivity and measurability so the decision could be repeated with the same result. Vendor selection is a related process, but focuses specifically on choosing third-party vendors or products.
And finally, you mentioned earlier the importance of assessing and reviewing everything periodically.
Yes, that's critical. It closes the loop. It's absolutely vital to periodically review and assess the classification classes you've defined. the classifications you've assigned to specific assets and data, the effectiveness of the security controls you've implemented, and the relevance of your policies and procedures. Laws change, regulations evolve, business requirements shift, new technologies emerge, new threats appear. All of this might necessitate changing your classification scheme, reclassifying certain assets, or updating your security controls and handling procedures. Asset security is definitely not a one-time setup task. It's a continuous, ongoing process of management, assessment, and adaptation.
Wow, that really was a deep exploration into asset security. It's crystal clear now that it's so much more than just, classifying documents or counting servers. It's really about fundamentally understanding everything your organization values, tracing its entire life cycle, knowing exactly who is responsible for it at each stage, and then meticulously applying the right layers of protection, whether it's in use, moving across the network, or sitting in storage, even figuring out how to destroy it properly and provably at the end.
Exactly. It's a truly comprehensive approach. It starts with identifying those specific types of sensitive data like PII and PHI. It requires establishing clear classification levels with appropriate labels for systems and markings for people. It demands assigning unambiguous ownership and defining key roles like controllers, processors, custodians, and stewards. It involves actively managing the entire lifecycle, careful collection, ongoing maintenance, defined retention periods, and secure destruction techniques that address data remnants. And finally, it culminates in implementing the right mix of security controls encryption everywhere appropriate. DLP to prevent leaks, maybe CASBs for cloud security, DRM for specific content, anonymization or pseudonymization for privacy, all driven by policy, guided by baselines and tailoring, and ensuring full compliance with relevant regulations. It really is all about safeguarding what matters most appropriately throughout its existence.
It definitely highlights that core security idea.
Yeah.
You absolutely have to know what you have before you can even begin to protect it effectively.
And remembering, too, that the protection needs to be dynamic. It needs to follow the asset or the data wherever it goes, physically or logically, and adapt to whatever state it happens to be in at any given moment.
So for you listening right now, maybe take a moment to think about the information and the digital assets that you value most, whether it's your personal photos and financial records or sensitive project data at work. How would you classify them? What steps would you or should you take to protect them throughout their entire life, including getting rid of them securely when you're done?
That's a great point. These asset security principles aren't just abstract concepts for large corporations. Understanding them helps you appreciate the often invisible security measures that protect your own data every day online. And hopefully, it might prompt you to think a bit more consciously about how you handle your own sensitive information, like securely wiping an old phone before selling it, or using strong, unique passwords for important accounts.
Okay, here's a final thought to leave you with, something to mull over. Given how rapidly technology data usage patterns and regulations are changing, think AI, IoT, ever-increasing data volumes, how can organizations possibly ensure their asset classification schemes and handling requirements remain effective and relevant over time without becoming so complex and rigid that they become an overwhelming burden on innovation and day-to-day operations?
That is indeed a huge question, and finding that right balance between robust security control and operational agility in a constantly shifting landscape, well, that demands constant attention, adaptation, and likely emphasizes the critical need for those periodic reviews and automated tools we discussed. It's an ongoing challenge.
That brings us to the end of this asset security exploration. Thank you so much for joining us today on Tech Explained.